In 8 months, I lost $143,000 in annual client revenue. Not because my work got worse, not because the market shifted, because someone I trusted with everything my client files, my pricing structure, my relationships had been quietly building a version of my business on the side, using everything I had given him to make it work. He was gone before I noticed the pattern. And by the time I did, 4 of my best clients were already sitting in meetings with him. I remember the morning I finally added it up. 6:45. Coffee I hadn't touched. A spreadsheet that kept coming out to the same number no matter how many times I recalculated it. There was a clause on page 4 of a document he had signed 3 years earlier. He had not thought about it since. I had not thought about it in months. That was about to change. But to understand why that clause mattered, you need to know exactly who my operations manager was and why I almost let him win. By the end of this, you will understand how a single paragraph in a standard employment agreement language, so common that most attorneys include it without a second thought, ended a competing business before it finished its second quarter. Not through anger, not through public confrontation, through documentation, civil court, and patience. This is what it looks like when the paper does the work. And there is one document I want you to remember, the one he signed and forgot, because it is the reason any of this is possible. I started the agency 6 years before any of this happened. It was a digital marketing firm, small, intentional, built around client relationships I maintained personally. I knew every client's birthday. I knew which ones preferred calls over emails. I knew which ones needed to hear a number 3 times before they believed it. That consistency, that almost obsessive attention to the relationship, was what kept clients renewing year after year. It was also, I would later understand, exactly what made my operations manager so dangerous. He came through a referral in year 3. His name was Derek. He was organized, articulate, and genuinely gifted at client communication. His references were strong. He came in as a project coordinator, and within 8 months, I had promoted him to operations manager and given him access to everything: the CRM, the contracts, the pricing templates, the internal notes I kept on every client relationship. He seemed like the kind of person who was building something alongside you. In his second year, we had a conversation at my kitchen table. I remember it clearly because it was late, and the rest of the building was quiet about whether it made sense to offer him equity. I went home and made a list of the reasons it was too soon, and a separate list of the reasons it might be exactly the right move. I kept both lists in a drawer and told myself I would revisit them at the end of the year. What I did not know, and would not learn until much later, was that Derek had already decided how this was going to end. The first sign was a client who did not return a call. That happened sometimes. People got busy. I followed up twice, and when she finally responded, she said she had decided to take her account in a different direction. No elaboration. I thanked her for the years and moved on. 3 weeks later, a second client said almost exactly the same thing. I want to be precise here about the sequence of what I found, because the order matters. The first thing I discovered was a company name. I searched the agency that 2 former clients had mentioned independently, a small firm in the same city that had reached out to them with a proposal shortly after they left me. The name meant nothing to me. I pulled up the website. Derek's face was in the About section. His name, his photo, his biography. I sat with that for a moment before I moved. The second thing I discovered was the timeline. I pulled the departure dates of both clients and cross-referenced them with Derek's resignation date 3 months earlier. He had resigned on a Wednesday. The first client departure notice came 4 days later. But the third thing I found was the one that stopped me cold. I called a client I still had, a woman named Lisa Tran, who had been with me for 4 years, and asked her, carefully, if anyone had reached out to her recently. She hesitated. Then she told me that yes, she had received a call, about 6 weeks before Derek resigned, from someone who said he was exploring new opportunities and wanted to touch base. She had assumed it was networking. She hadn't mentioned it to me. 6 weeks before he resigned, he had been calling clients while he was still sitting in my office. I went back to the CRM. Derek's last login before his resignation was the Friday before he handed in his letter. He had accessed the full client database, every contact, every contract value, every renewal date. Not a portion of it. All of it. I made a list on a legal pad. 7 clients contacted. 4 had left. Revenue impact, $143,000 annually. A woman named Sandra Okafor, 2 years with my agency. A $34,000 annual contract gone. A company called Meridian Logistics, managed by a man named Warren Cole, $28,000 a year. 4 years of renewals gone. A healthcare firm that had been my largest account for 3 years, responsible for $47,000 in annual billings, which told me via certified letter that they had chosen to consolidate their marketing under a new provider. The new provider's address was 4 miles from mine, and the LLC he had filed to do business under I checked the state business registry that same afternoon had been registered 61 days before the day he handed me his letter of resignation. 61 days. He had been in my office, on my payroll, with access to my files, for 61 days after the business that would replace me was already registered. The first attorney I called told me that non-compete agreements were difficult to enforce, especially involving a former employee rather than a business partner. He said courts tended to look unfavorably on overly broad restrictions. He told me that unless I could show specific, documented harm, and even then the process would be expensive, slow, and uncertain. I thanked him and did not hire him. The second attorney said something similar, that non-competes in my state were enforceable only if the language was narrow, the geography was specific, and the time restriction was reasonable. She said mine sounded like a standard template. Standard templates, she said, were often challenged. I drove home and sat in the parking lot of my office building for a long time. $143,000. 3 years. A kitchen table conversation about equity that I had never finished. And 2 attorneys telling me the piece of paper I had been counting on might not hold. I thought about letting it go. That is the honest version of what happened. I ran the math on legal fees against the probability of recovery, against the emotional cost of a prolonged dispute. And I thought seriously about closing the folder and moving forward. And then I did something nobody told me to do. I went back to the original contract. Not a summary of it. Not an attorney's description of it. The document itself. And I read every word of the non-compete clause, out loud, slowly, in the front seat of my car. What I had was this: a signed employment agreement, dated 3 years and 2 months before Derek's resignation, that included a non-compete clause covering 18 months, a 50-mile radius. And this was the language that mattered any business offering substantially similar services to clients Derek had directly managed or contacted during his employment. Not any business in the industry, any business serving the same clients. He had contacted 7 of my active clients before resigning. He had taken 4 of them. He was now providing those 4 clients people he had managed on my behalf, using my systems on my payroll, with the same category of services I had contracted to deliver to them. The clause was not broad. It was specific. It described, with precision, exactly what he had done. I also had the CRM access log showing he had exported the full client database the Friday before he left. I had the registration date of his LLC. I had Lisa Tran's account of the call she received while Derek was still employed. And I had 3 years of signed performance reviews documenting which clients had been under his management. I organized every document by date. I typed a 1-page timeline at the top. And one name I kept coming back to the second attorney. The one who had said standard templates were often challenged. She had also said one other thing, almost as an aside: if the conduct is as specific as you are describing, and the clause addresses that conduct directly, you may have more than you think. I called her back the next morning and told her I had read the clause again. She asked me what I had found in the CRM logs. Then, she said, "Send me everything." I sent it that evening, every document, every date, every name. I signed the retention agreement at my kitchen table, the same table where I had kept 2 lists in a drawer about whether to offer him equity. The civil complaint was filed on a Tuesday. I was at my desk when my attorney called to confirm it was done. The first motion was for a temporary restraining order, a court order, requiring Derek to immediately cease all contact with any client named in the complaint. My attorney said TROs in breach of contract cases moved quickly when the conduct was documented and the harm was ongoing. I did not allow myself to anticipate it. I kept working. The TRO was granted 48 hours later. Derek appeared at the hearing with his own attorney. My attorney told me afterward that Derek had been relaxed going in, that he had made a comment in the hallway about the case being a nuisance filing. He did not appear relaxed when the judge granted the order. He was now prohibited from contacting or soliciting any of my clients by name, and from providing services to the 4 clients who had already engaged his agency. Discovery began the following month. This is where the process stopped being fast and started being thorough. What discovery produced over 11 weeks was a documented record of what Derek had actually done. Not my reconstruction of it. His own emails. His own calendar entries. His own messages to clients, dated and timestamped. The planning had started 5 months before he resigned. Not 6 weeks, 5 months. There were internal notes written in a shared cloud folder that Derek had apparently forgotten I held administrator access to, outlining a plan to offer my clients discounted pricing in the first 6 months as an incentive to switch. Detailed notes. Client by client. Revenue projections built on my own billing history. And then came the part I did not expect. My attorney called and said, "I think we should look at whether there are other businesses where he has done this before." I had not thought of that. I should have. It took 2 weeks of research. What they found was a small agency in a city about 90 miles away, where Derek had worked for 2 years before joining my firm. He had left that agency under similar circumstances. Several clients had departed in the months following his resignation. The owner of that agency had not pursued legal action. He had not known the non-compete clause in his own employment documents might apply. His attorney, at the time, had not flagged it. Derek had done this before. In a different city, with a different business, using the same method. And the person it happened to had never known that the paper to stop it had already been signed. When my attorney presented that history to Derek's legal team, the tone of the negotiation changed within a week. What had been framed as a contested enforcement action became a settlement conversation. The terms were these: a permanent injunction prohibiting Derek from contacting or serving any client named in the complaint for the remaining duration of the non-compete period, a payment of $89,000 in damages, and full reimbursement of my legal fees to that point. He did not admit fault. That is standard. But the injunction was made permanent by court order, and the $89,000 was transferred in full within 30 days of the signed agreement. 3 weeks later, I received a letter from the former owner of the other agency. He had heard about the case through a professional contact who knew us both. He thanked me. He said he had not known that what happened to him had happened to someone else, that there was a name for the pattern, that the paper had existed all along. I wrote back. I told him what I had told myself in that parking lot. The document was always there. Someone just had to read it. Justice does not give back the 8 months. That is what people do not understand about the word. It does not restore the 4 relationships I had spent years building before someone walked out the door with them in a CRM export. It does not return the nights I spent recalculating the same numbers. It does not undo the moment I sat in a parking lot and seriously considered letting him win. What justice does is close the door before the next person walks through it. The owner 90 miles away had lost clients too. He had rebuilt, the way small business owners do, carefully, patiently, without announcement. He had not known that a piece of paper filed 3 years earlier could have changed what happened to him. No one told him to read the full clause. Derek had a pattern. He had used it twice. My attorney believes, and I have no reason to disagree, that he had already been identifying his next market before the settlement was finalized. There would not be a third time. I was not the first person he did this to, but I was the first one who went back to the document, read every word, and built the folder. Some things you build slowly: reputation, trust, a business that remembers its clients' birthdays. Some protections work the same way. One clause, one careful reading, one decision not to let the math talk you out of it. Mine held. 3 years after the fact. But on my own terms. 6 weeks after the settlement closed, a message came through my agency's contact form. A woman in another state, a small communications firm, 8 years in business. She said she had found me through a search. She had a question about non-compete enforcement. She described a former employee who had resigned 4 months earlier. A new agency in the same market. 3 clients, she said, had followed him out the door shortly after. She had the original employment contract in a folder on her desk. She had never read the non-compete section. She included the name of the former employee's new agency at the bottom of the message. I searched it in her state's business registry. It had been registered 11 weeks before his resignation date. I knew that number. 61 days. 11 weeks. I had seen what it meant. The agency name meant nothing to me. But when I looked at the principal listed on the registration, the named founder, the person responsible, I recognized the work. If this story reminded you of something you are still inside a document you signed and set aside, a clause you have not read in years, a pattern you are watching unfold right now, drop it in the comments. You may already be one piece of someone else's folder.